Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to have you join us today for a candid conversation featuring our Chief Operations Officer, Kayla, as well as Dr. Sharma and Lexi Vincent. Dr. Sharma is the Director of Structural Interventions at Stanford Health Care. He is nationally recognized in the transcatheter structural heart therapy space with expertise spanning across aortic, mitral, tricuspid valve interventions, as well as LAAC and complex structural procedures. He plays a key role in advancing innovation at Stanford. He's passionate about clinical research, which would be a core of the conversation today. He also is an early adopter of technology, and that has led to really great performance at Stanford across the cardiovascular line. Lexi Vincent has also joined us today. She has been a core advocate for the CardioCare platform and its adoption and expansion across multiple areas at Stanford. She is the advanced lead sonographer and again, a champion for CardioCare, and we're honored to have her here today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kayla, who will kick us off for this conversation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of today's call. Thank you.
Thanks, Shay. And thanks, Rahul and Lexi, for being here, especially early Pacific time this morning. As Shay teed up, we're going to spend about the next 40 or 45 minutes walking through the journey that you've been on at Stanford with the CardioCare platform. And then we'll take some Q&A at the end. So I'll echo Shay's reminder to the audience to put questions in the chat so that we can get to them at the end. I'll just jump in. Rahul, you brought CardioCare into Stanford when you were pretty new to the institution. Can you just walk us through what your goals were for the program, what the beginning of that journey looked like?
Yeah. So I think that the role of cardiocare evolved pretty significantly from when I brought it in to today. When I first brought in cardiocare, it was really with the objective of finding a platform that could help organize our structural heart program. So I came from Cedars, a very high volume, high energy, busy institution. But what came with that volume was a little bit of organized chaos. And so I was looking for something that could help organize my workflow so that patients didn't fall through the cracks. The team was effectively able to communicate and identify where patients were in their journey from initially being referred all the way through treatment and beyond. So that was sort of the primary objective as I set out to look at the various platforms that were out there. And of course, once I met with the CardioCare team and learned a little bit more about the platform, it obviously evolved into much more than that. And then where we are today, and obviously we'll discuss that in more detail.
Okay. And Lexi, since the introduction of CardioCare, Rahul hit on this, started out as organize the chaos and make sure patients don't fall through the cracks. How have you witnessed the evolution of how Stanford uses this within your clinic, within your just general everyday processes? I know you've come a long way since the beginning.
Yes, thank you. I think we have too. I think when we first started using CardioCare, we were kind of just doing basic patient identification and reaching out for trials, and we really expanded to have it be an all-encompassing tool to manage Dr. Sharma's clinic. And as Dr. Sharma said, it's really helped us to make sure we're not missing patients, that they're not being lost to follow up, and we've kind of removed our valve clinic coordinators. We're working off these huge Excel spreadsheets which had a ton of patient information, but very hard to find the information when needed in an efficient way. So we've completely moved our tracking from an Excel spreadsheet into this unified platform that our entire clinic can work off of.
And Lexi, I remember when we first started this journey, it was pretty progressive at the time for you to be using a shared Google spreadsheet instead of sticky notes and spreadsheets that were more manual and in the office. Maybe talk a little bit about CardioCare versus even the shared Google spreadsheets. You talked about them being difficult to get to, but how have you replaced some of that functionality?
So I think it's funny that the Google spreadsheet is considered progressive, but we were also using a post-it system as well. CardioCare has really wonderful features that have been allowed us to make it individualized to the clinic. So we have three interventionalists in our clinic. We can label by provider. We can customize it to our workflow. There's a scheduling manager in CardioCare where you can set alerts on patients if it in terms of testing follow up. Make sure that you know when they've had a certain test. You can also assign alerts, which is very helpful in our clinic to other users because we have a lot of staff that works 410. So if someone's off, we can assign to someone else to make sure that this is picked up on a day that they might be off. So there's just a lot of customizable, nice tools in CardioCare that allows us to run efficiently.
Okay. And you've both hit on, I've heard you both say a flavor of safety net and making sure that patients aren't falling through the cracks. Rahul, maybe if I start with you, tell me a little bit more about that, because I feel like the impression would be that Stanford wouldn't have any patients falling through the cracks by nature of the sheer prestige of the institution. So, talk to me a little bit more about making sure people don't fall through the cracks and what that looks like for you all, and why that was an area you felt passionate about.
Yeah, I think that patients most frequently complain about one thing, and that is that it's hard to get a hold of someone or no one got back to them. That's the commonest negative feedback. And so the on the other side of it, a lot of time, effort, and energy goes into trying to recruit patients from referring physicians. And so when patients do fall through the cracks because of some of the issues that Lexi touched on, very frustrating because both patient and referring satisfaction is impacted. And so to me, it was really important that, you know, aside from finding these patients and filling the funnel and growing volumes, we also maintain quality, not just of what we're doing in the procedural setting, but also in terms of taking care of the patient so that the satisfaction for both the patient and the referring was maintained. And so now that we have a platform where, if someone reaches out to me and says, hey, where's patient Mrs. Smith? And, we referred her. The old way is I would search my texts for Mrs. Smith. I would then search my emails. I would then call the clinic and maybe someone had a post-it note on their desk. Now, any one of us can jump into the CardioCare platform, find the patient, but more importantly, see exactly where they are in their structural heart journey, and then, provide that feedback. And then, as Lexi was saying, patients who, for example, may not necessarily be ready for a particular step in their journey right now, we can set automatic alerts within that CardioCare platform so that none of us has to, bear the burden of trying to remember or set a reminder for ourselves. But really, it's a programmatic reminder and checklist to make sure we're keeping an eye on these patients. And similarly, when we know we've got new therapies, whether it's commercial or trial-based coming up, if we're seeing patients along the way that may be in the near future candidates for those therapies, we can set alerts for those patients as well. So there's a number of redundancies in place to make sure that that issue doesn't arise where we're missing things just because of a lack of clarity and communication.
Okay, great. Lexi, anything to add from your end? I know you hit on the alerts and scheduling manager to help you keep track of patients in their journey.
I just want to add that when you go into CardioCare, you can kind of go directly into I call it like a patient's chart in CardioCare, and we can manually enter notes. And we have, because since I've been here in 2021, we kind of have like a running ticker of the patient's journey, which has been really helpful for continuity of care with the patient as we've had staff turnover, and it's been great. Like the nurses are such a fan of it because they can be like, oh, look at this is what happened in 2023, and then they know just coming in newer to our clinic kind of the patient's progress. So that's been really nice to have that historical there without doing such a deep dive in our EMR to try to
Yeah.
find that.
Yeah. Do you feel like that saves you time as a team to have that summary there?
1000%.
Okay. I know we get a lot of questions about how does this contribute to efficiencies down the road, and so I think it's important to highlight what you just said there about it may take time to learn it and start to use it, but then down the road it can pay off in dividends. Maybe switching gears a little bit, Rahul, you've talked about how somewhere between 20 and 25% of your total patient volume is being sourced out of patients you found in cardio care, commercial and clinical trial. Can you talk to us a little bit about that's a pretty significant percentage for someone as busy as you are. How has that influenced your sourcing strategy as you think about how you're going to perform in trials, volumes you can sign up for over the year for commercial therapies, et cetera?
So I think it's really improved the efficiency and resource utilization. So sort of pre-cardio care, the clinic model was very traditional, which I think was what most people do. You sit in clinic and you wait for referrals to come in. And a lot of that patient population that we see in clinic, it's very heterogeneous. So, for a given 10 patients, maybe two or three will translate to a procedure. Maybe another two or three, it's sort of a watch and wait. And then the remaining might just be completely inappropriate, but they've somehow slipped through the cracks. With cardio care and, that 25% of patients in clinic being sourced, it's a very refined population. So the likelihood that that patient has appropriate pathology, which will then translate to a procedure, is much, much higher. And so that means that all of us in clinic, myself included, are spending our time wisely on patients that are appropriate for us. But beyond that, in terms of a halo effect, we're also using resources like echo, TEE, CT, which aren't necessarily readily available and can delay care of others if we're using them inappropriately. So the resource allocation has also improved as a result. In terms of our clinical trials, it's been incredibly helpful and advantageous for trial recruitment because we're able to either through a customized module that's very specific for a particular trial within the platform, or kind of building our own, which reflects the kind of inclusion exclusion criteria we're interested in, able to identify a very target-rich patient list, and then we can be very focused in our outreach to the providers who are managing these patients to give them some education on a new therapy or a new study, and then try and pull patients forward rather than hoping that the referring community is aware of a new technology or a new study and sends patients. And that's been reflected in the volume and the pace at which we've enrolled in clinical trials since CardioCare. It also allows us to be a little bit proactive in ascertaining whether we can participate in a study. We can very quickly, do a look back, for example, over the last 12 months and say, if we were to run a study on this particular device for this particular pathology, roughly how many patients would we expect to see? And then we can be very intentional in the studies that we take on because we know that actually we could enroll in this study well, or conversely, we don't have as many patients as we thought we had. And then when it comes to the site initiation questionnaires, we can be very honest based on data about whether or not we would be a suitable study site.
Yeah. And you and I have talked a little bit about how you commit differently based on the fact that you now have information that maybe others don't have or you didn't have in the past. This is where I get to maybe highlight your performance a little bit because I think you've been a top 5 enroller in every trial you've participated in for the last however many years. Uh, Lexi, I'm gonna ask you to fill in a little bit more on what Rahul highlighted. So, Rahul, you nicely highlighted that you're using both the structured list that we provide based on certain trials, as well as I'll fill in the database functionality to create your own queries. Lexi, can you talk a little bit more about, for a site that's getting started, if there isn't a pre-built list for every trial that they're interested in finding patients for? You've been building these database queries from the beginning. What does that look like, and how would you coach sites to get started with that?
Sure. So, the research suite that CardioCare offers is phenomenal. All of our research coordinators at Stanford actually specifically ask for dedicated lists for every trial now. They're all like, where's my list? But beyond that, the database feature in CardioCare is really expansive. You can search our whole database. You can search by patient or you can search by echo. There's over 300 searchable fields in the database, and you can really tailor it down to any kind of criteria, and it's really invaluable. We just looked at recently just our moderate or greater aortic stenosis population, and we kind of did a comparison between our echo database query versus the ignite database query, and the echo database query kind of just ends with the echo numbers, right? But then if you go into ignite into our CardioCare database, we were able to just filter out by treated, by palliative, by death, by NYHA class. There's just so many options that you can do in there that can really help target the exact population that you want.
Yeah. So you're back to I think the efficiency theme that Rahul was highlighting earlier with the tools let you get to a smaller, more precise set of patients that you can do something with instead of
Yes.
a really broad set of patients you have to filter through. Is that right?
Yeah, and it makes it more manageable. And even in terms of our reach out beyond the clinical data for the patient, we can target by managing provider, which we get through CardioCare. We can see if we need to focus on a heart failure group. We can see if we need to focus on a primary care physician group. We can see who has the most number of these patients. So that is also very helpful in our reach out.
Yeah. Um, let's spend a little more time on that because I know we've talked about this as well. So Rahul, as you think about how you're investing your very limited time, particularly when it comes to outreach efforts, can you talk a little bit about how you've used the data that you've seen within CardioCare to prioritize where you're spending time and on what patient groups?
Yeah, I think again, CardioCare has been responsible as a catalyst for our evolution. Um, in terms of outreach, and I sort of refer to pre-CardioCare post. So there was a very traditional model of outreach where, when I got to Stanford, I spent a lot of time initially going out and doing dinners and lunches and meeting both current and prospective referring physicians. And it takes up a lot of time. It's incredibly onerous, but that's sort of, what else do you do? What I realized and what became increasingly frustrating was the return on investment is fairly low. Um, a lot of these referring, well, first of all, you're not necessarily getting everyone who is a referring physician to attend these. People, are busy in their personal lives. Often, if it's after hours, it's difficult to get them there. So that's the first part. You're not getting everyone.
Yeah.
Then, of those who come, some are equally interested in the free meal as they are in what you have to say about a new therapy or a new study. And then the biggest piece is when they go away, retention of it. Again, they get back into their busy clinical practice and they're just seeing patients. They're trying to take care of patients. And so, uh, what I said at a dinner 3 weeks ago may not be sticking, and they may actually be seeing patients that I was very much referring to, but it's just slipped their mind because it's not top of mind.
Sure.
Fast forward to using CardioCare, we now, all of my outreach, there's no more generic outreach. It's all very intentional. So, for example, we decided in the last 12 months to make a bit more of a dedicated effort to grow our left atrial appendage closure program. I was very passive about that just because there was so much else to do. Um, and so what we did is we used the Ignite platform to identify patients who were what we deemed very high risk in terms of their CHA2DS2-VASc and HAS-BLED scores, and who had had a bleed-related admission to the Stanford system within the last 12 months and had documented active atrial fibrillation. So this is a very highly curated, refined list of patients, which, almost everyone would agree would be potentially a good candidate for that therapy.
Mm-hmm.
We then ranked those patients in terms of volume by referring provider. And then what I did was, using industry partners as well, went out and met out the top 10 referring providers who manage most of these patients. So we're now going after people we know are managing these patients. We know they're managing a lot of these patients, and we know whether they're managing the right kind of patients we're interested in. Then once we go and meet them, so now our time is being used well, we describe the therapy, describe the ideal patient. But what's very impactful is then handing that provider a list of their potential candidate patients,
Mm-hmm.
because then it suddenly moves from a very generic, sort of hopefully you one day meet a patient that fits this criteria to these are real patients of yours, and that resonates. And the translation of handing that list to then getting referrals is a much, much greater return on investment than what we were doing before. So that's how we've tailored things. We've also used it as a way to educate physicians on new therapies and new studies. So again, we've got the AR dedicated TAVR devices now, and so by finding who manages most of the patients with AR, we're able to kind of target our education to them, because there's no point doing a dinner for 150 people if 130 of them will never see an AR patient in the next 5 years. It's just a waste of time and resources. So
Right.
the outreach piece has really been refined by use of the platform.
Okay. So back to the theme on better resource utilization because you have better data and better visibility to where patients are sitting. Um, let's talk a little bit if we go back to you both hit on it, cross-trial efficiencies. You have been enrolled in many, many trials all at the same time, even within structural heart, in addition to all of the other trials that Stanford is running simultaneously. We've talked a little bit about how helpful CardioCare has been as a tool for keeping track of patients that may screen fail from one trial but are candidates for another or aren't quite candidates, et cetera. Maybe some that fall out and were better commercial candidates. Lexi and Rahul, can you just hit on how you feel like this is helpful in terms of tracking patients for either commercial or alternate therapies? How would you do that otherwise?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, I would sit in a valve meeting, and for example, we'd be presenting a patient for a TAVR with severe AS. And as we were going through their echo findings, I would notice that they had moderate or moderate to severe MR as well. And I'd text the coordinator and say, can you please put them on a MR watch list? Now we don't have to do that. And so, we're able to either keep an eye on patients where we might want to treat another valve pathology down the track, or we can keep an eye on patients who, as you alluded to, weren't necessarily, excuse me, appropriate for a therapy or a trial right now, but something else may come up, or the trial may switch to being continued access and there's no randomization, or there might be a registry that they can participate in. The TMVR space is a great example. We've only had one TMVR trial sort of standalone for the last couple of years. And some of those patients that screen failed, we can very easily go back and find those patients to now apply to a commercially available TMVR device without having to, find someone to go manually back and try and sift through all these files. We can very easily look back and just find those patients and quickly ascertain whether they might be candidates for this new therapy that's available now.
Because of all the labels and notes that Lexi's left for the team, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And, Lexi and together with one of our other colleagues, Martina, one of our APPs, are incredibly helpful. And obviously, I think we talked about this very briefly, but there is a culture change that has to occur, but it's a positive culture change. And again, this platform is a driver for that. There was a little bit of hesitancy from our clinic staff who were very comfortable with their post-it notes and Excel spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you can't scale that. A program can't grow with those sort of grassroots tools. Certainly not in a way that's efficient. Certainly not in a way that ensures patients don't get missed, and certainly not in a way where you can be a top enroller in clinical trials. And so, yeah, Lexi and Martina have been big drivers of that cultural change.
And now the clinic staff too, right, Lexi? So you hit on this a little bit earlier, but that's been part of the natural expansion from patient identification to tracking, and now the whole team is using it in parts, right? Can you talk a little bit about how that's worked?
Yeah, the whole team is now using it, and it was a little bit of growing pains in the beginning, but now they say they cannot imagine life without cardio care, which is just music to my ears. But just to go back to a little bit about the trials and the labels, I think just what Dr. Sharma was saying, especially with the TMVR space, we've really been able to we've labeled patients who have screen failed for trials, and we kind of have them on this watch list for future therapies. And recently, Dr. Sharma will just send a message to our clinic, and he'll be like, find everyone who screen failed this and bring them to us, which I think would normally bring people panic, right? You'd be like, oh my gosh, how do I
Yeah.
find this amount of people? And he wants this list and he wants it by Friday. And it's
Thursday.
wonderful because Thursday. But, but we have all these patients like just completely labeled, and then CardioCare has a very nice feature where you can also export. I mean, there's a little bit of old-fashionedness in all of us, I think, where we want to export to a spreadsheet so we can just have something in our hands and bring to a meeting, but we can just have that list ready for him. We have a list for an upcoming meeting. So that's just been a very nice way to organize and ensure these patients aren't missed. And then it's really nice too for patients that they feel that they're not being lost track of, right? Like if they're told that they're not a candidate for a certain something, and then 6 months later we're like, hey, we have a new something to offer you, right? Like that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I would imagine goes back to enhancing the patient experience that Rahul you talked about as a reason for bringing in a tool in the first place. So I'm sure they're appreciative. Um, Lexi, you hit on this a little bit too earlier, But I think from one of the things that people tend to underestimate is a tool like this to help with coordination for patients. So your team is using the tool, but then you also have research screening nurses who are using the tool and you all are communicating back and forth. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like from a care coordination perspective? Because I've been impressed how wide you've gone with it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a huge tool. I think just from my personal observations, sometimes our aortic stenosis patients are a little bit more streamlined, and our mitral tricuspid patients really are more nuanced. And just with their testing and the follow-up, it's really allowed us to kind of keep track in our clinic of what is going on with them. And then in terms of our research coordinators, we always talk about how there's a human element with cardio care, you need time. But even with our research coordinators, when I meet with them, if sometimes I'm like, if you can only give me an hour a week, right? Like that's great. Like if you can get through screening 5 patients every single week and help out, because there's no end to the patients that populate in cardio care. It's very helpful. So it's really helped. And then back to the notes section in the patient chart, the research coordinators will screen in or out a patient, leave their notes in it, and then I can see it, the nurses can see it, the APPs who are taking care of them can see it, Dr. Sharma can see it. We can see what needs to kind of happen with next steps. It's just very helpful to have a unified platform.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. And then, Lexi, I'm going to come back to you about how your feedback has shaped the feature development in the platform, but I'm going to ask Rahul about clinical trials here for just a second first. So we've spent time talking about what a perfect AI-enabled world would look like for trials. Uh, and so I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about, if there were 400 programs using a tool like this to do clinical trial and recruitment, what would that do to change the environment, the ability to forecast trials, the ability to find patients quickly? So think about if we put the Stanford experience in more institutions, how could that change the future of clinical trial enrollment and recruitment?
I think everyone wins. I think starting with the trial sponsors, which are usually industry, you know, the ability to identify sites. Let's say you did have 400 sites on the Ignite platform. Very quickly, which sites are actually going to be able to enroll? And most of the enrollment is driven by having the patients. Of course, there are other factors, but let's just talk about filling the funnel. So very quickly, you'd be able to say, do they have the patients at an appropriate cadence
Yeah.
that would meet broadly our inclusion exclusion? So picking the right sites to start with. And then the sites themselves could identify, just like we're doing, whether they themselves would be good candidates, again, based on having the patients and determining whether it was worth it in terms of their own resource allocation. A lot of sites want to be part of every trial, but if you look sort of below the surface, it's very costly to even just get a trial set up, and even more costly and economically inefficient to get it set up but not enroll. If you have a trial that's a high enroll, it can actually be very profitable, depending on, of course, the study and the reimbursement. But it helps to offset your setup costs. And generally speaking, you can run a decent profit on running a trial if you enroll. And so determining which trials, if any, you should be in can be guided by data in doing this. And then the third part is you actually then, the research team, the research coordinators, instead of trawling and looking for patients, you're actively enrolling patients, treating patients. Patients benefit from that. They get access to new technologies on new platforms. And your research team is also happy because that's what they signed up to do. No research team wants to be sitting around, tumbleweed blowing through, not finding patients. They want to be enrolling. And then finally, if you are a high enroller, you're then participating in publications. It then begets getting the next generation or another device or another study from that particular sponsor. So really, everyone wins, from the patient to the sponsor to the physicians to the research coordinators.
Yeah, and if I double click on that a little bit, you all have used trial lists, whether pre-built or otherwise, at the beginning of a trial to help get it started, where you had it available right then when you were looking at enrollment, getting patients. You've had it in the middle, you've had it at the end. What counsel would you give to other hospitals about the value of having a list at any point in their trial journey? Is it more helpful at the beginning? Does it help you anyway in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of trials we're running right now where, for a variety of reasons, it's been a little bit more challenging to enroll. And so having the platforms allows us to give us a sort of a little surge or a boost where we say, okay, now we're going to double down. And, I'll say to Lexi, she'll say, what are your priorities, when we get together at the moment? And I'll say, well, we're surging ahead in this. I'm very happy with our rate of enrollment here. And I feel like we're confident seeing patients. I really want to focus on this particular therapy or study that's struggling a little bit. Let's really double down our efforts there. So then, all that data is there, but then we'll really focus on filtering through the data that's relevant to this particular study or studies, because we want to sort of boost those. And so it's really helpful, as a program director to try and quickly pick and choose. It's just like running a company. Which of my silos or verticals are not as profitable, and really use data to help try and boost those while the other ones are running along quite smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, we get questions a lot, and I'd like you both to weigh in here. We get questions a lot on how do the referrers react when you reach out and you say, hey, you've got patients for this trial, or we think you have a lot of potential patients for this commercial therapy. Rahul, I know you do that. Martina does some of that. Lexi, you're flagging those patients and keeping track of them. What's the reaction been like to that sort of outreach, and has it changed over time?
I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. There was a lot of fear, and I'll go so far as to say unfounded fear, that referrings would react very poorly to this. A sense that someone's telling them how to manage their patients, someone's watching them. We have not had that experience, and a lot of my colleagues who are very prolific users of this platform similarly have not had that experience. Look, I think in like all things, it's all in the delivery. When we started, we sought not to send out some mass, notification that we were doing this and we were going to be taking their patients. When we started, it was very much a high touch point, human engagement, mostly driven by me, where I would reach out to the referring, explain the platform, explain that we'd identified a patient that may benefit from a particular therapy or enrollment in a study, and we would ask the question, would you like us to evaluate? So it's very much asking, not telling. And
Mm-hmm.
that was very well received. Either they would just say, yes, that's great, or they would say, oh, tell me more about that study. So it's an opportunity to educate them about, something new. Over time, as we've been doing this for a few years, a lot of our referrings are now very familiar with this platform. So we don't even have to explain it. We just reach out and say, hey, this patient popped up on our system. Do you mind if we evaluate? They're like, sure. Now we've been doing it so long that a lot of the referring partners are known to us. So Martina or the clinic will reach out directly to them. I don't even have to do it. If it's someone new, I'll try and cultivate that relationship first. And
Yeah.
then, a lot of the time we have patients that are what I call the flyby echo findings. So they're in the hospital system for a
Mm-hmm.
non-cardiovascular reason. For whatever reason, someone's done an echo or ordered one. And so we find pathology that's significant. And so they're a captive audience. We'll, have one of our fellows go see the patient. We'll ensure that they're scheduled to see us in the outpatient clinic. So we capture that patient as they're flying by the Stanford system. So that there's, a lot of incidental patients captured through that process.
Yeah. And Lexi, I know that you've leveraged that pretty extensively to make sure, again, kind of back to the theme of no patients falling through the cracks when somebody's inpatient or, again, Rahul, like you said, has incidental findings that they're being uncovered and responded to. How would you do that without a system like CardioCare? If you wanted to try and do that in Epic or yourself, is there a good alternative, or was that part of why you brought this tool in?
I think it would be harder to pull out from Epic because CardioCare just brings it to light so easily. I mean, if you think about it, CardioCare is basically turning kind of every echo lab into like a real-time screening engine, right? So it's just bringing all these patients, but you could pull it out from your data. And I think we are very conscientious about when reaching out to a patient's referring, right, to figure out if the referring would like us to evaluate their patient, as Dr. Sharma said. But there's patients, right, who come in through the emergency room who have, when I very first started CardioCare, there was a patient who had just moved to the area and was seen at an urgent care clinic, had no provider, and she had a severe valvular disease. And we were able to reach out to the patient, and she alerted to us quicker, right, and get her in, brought her in earlier for treatment in parallel with her being set up, right, with a cardiology clinic, but she was able to get evaluated for her valve disease. And that's someone that we made a big difference with that way.
And you have lots of
Yeah,
those.
I think
Go ahead, Rahul.
yeah, I'll double click on that. There's also that group where they don't have a managing provider, at least not a cardiologist, and so we'll actually reach out directly to the patient, and they love it because they feel like, oh, I didn't really understand why that test was ordered, and I'm so happy someone's keeping an eye on me. And so that's been positively received as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great addition in an era where we worry about how patients are going to react to a screening tool, looking potentially for things that we might have missed. You both hit on, I think, a couple of themes in our conversation so far. One that I've heard a couple of times is, it takes work at the beginning and then the work pays off in a lot of ways. So, Rahul, you talked about it took work because you did that individualized outreach at the beginning, and now everyone's conditioned to expect outreach. That's a much easier process. Lexi, you talked about, again, maybe some resistance in the beginning to adopting tools, but now, everybody's conditioned to it. They like the tool, they're used to it. What advice would you give other programs who are starting in terms of your investment up front and what to expect longer term?
Look, I think it's like any sort of small business. You have to put in the work to expect the yield. I think a lot of people shy away from the upfront cost, whether that's the literal financial cost or the personnel cost. But I will say from our own experience and that of, again, others who are using this, overall, even accounting for that both financial and indirect cost that you have to put in to get this going, it's dwarfed by your current costs in terms of patients missed, procedures missed, inefficiencies of workflow. Lexi talked about this. Our clinic suddenly had a drastic drop in their administrative burden by using CardioCare as the platform through which, we're performing all of this. Our C-suite admin recognized very quickly that the cost of getting this in and the annual subscription cost was nothing compared to the yield that we've got in terms of procedural volume, which, pays off multiples on the cost. We're able to, our publication volume has skyrocketed because of our performance in clinical trials. We're getting offers to be in every trial because we're performing so well. So, it's a very good investment, but it does take the work. I think a lot of people have this, thought that you turn it on and they will come.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. It's more that turn it on, set it up, put in a little bit of work, understand how it works best for you and your system as well. Because there is an element of tailoring it. Different healthcare contexts work differently, different physicians and their teams work differently. So there is, an element of customizing it for your
Mhm.
workflow. But once you get past that initial, you're humming. We've come such a long way since we first started. We haven't talked about our digital day, but Lexi, Martina, and I get together. I don't make it to all of them, but every week for about an hour, and we'll quickly sift through the patients. And Lexi drives that. Martina provides a little bit of a clinical flavor, and basically we sit there and go patient by patient. We spend about 30 seconds to a minute on each patient, and it's sort of a yes, no, and I'll either text the referring or Martina will send an epic message or reach out to the APP who's managing the patient, or we'll send the clinic a message and say, get this patient scheduled for this particular test or potential therapy.
Okay. Lexi, what would you add there in terms of the work you put in at the beginning, the work you put in now? How has that changed? What does it look like?
I think that as Dr. Sharma said, it definitely needs to be tailored, but I don't think there's anyone out there who is like, no, I really want to be working off an Excel spreadsheet with 80 tabs, right? Like there is people want a better system. So and I do remember in the beginning, kind of you have to take all this data, information about the patient and put it in CardioCare. And then as it kind of grew and people were using it more in our clinic, people were like, wow, this is really helpful. And then you just get feedback from everyone. Like, let's do this for Dr. Sharma's clinic. Let's label this for people who need upcoming imaging uploaded to whoever, right? So we just really were able to get everyone involved because I think everyone wanted a better system. And CardioCare, I just want to say, is a very easy platform to use. It's very user friendly. You don't need to be a whiz with computers. I was concerned about myself. I'm a sonographer. I was like, I came from sitting in a dark room for close to 20 years. How am I going to be able to use this? But it's incredibly user friendly. And just a little plug, the Ignite team is really wonderful. I mean, there is not one thought in my head that I've not shared with you guys that you have taken seriously and tried to implement to help improve the program and improve for our clinic.
Well, and you've made it better for everybody else. So I think we and everyone else on the call should thank you for all of that feedback. Um, I know we're getting questions in the Q&A panel. Shay was queuing up what we call the money slide. So Rahul, you started to go this direction earlier, but let's just briefly talk about, because it's a question we get a lot. We know that hospitals are trying to be wise about resourcing, good stewards of their money. So you had hit on this pays dividends when you look at what you invest in the platform versus what you get in terms of procedure growth. And now, obviously, we're taking a narrow lens. We're not even considering the network effects of developing new referral relationships, making sure patients don't fall through the cracks. This is more narrowly aligned to procedural and then clinical trial impact. But can you walk us through? This is a snapshot of your CardioCare identified interventions in 24 when this system tracking started, 25 and then 26 to date, as well as your clinical trials on the right-hand side. Um, Walk us through how you think about this, how you present this to your CV service line administrator. And then, I would say, how do you think about this narrow view versus the total view of ROI?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that, if we look at the most recent data, 2026, it's probably an underestimate of how much the cardiac care impact was because, as I mentioned, we sit in these digital days and we prompt the referring. And so the referring then sets off a more traditional referral pathway. But there's definitely an indirect element there, which I will say cardiac care encouraged referrals. So I think that number is an underestimate. Regardless, it's still a net significant positive in terms of volume. So on the commercial side, we clearly, see a gain there. And obviously everyone's DRG is slightly different, but most procedures make you money. Some very few in structural heart lose you money. So any net procedure gained is generally a win. The trials, you can see they're a drastic impact for us. And again, some of the indirect advantage of not wasting resources and time on trying to evaluate, screen, and test a bunch of patients that were not high yield candidates, but going straight to those that are. And so you can see there are over 60 patients across a variety of clinical trials that we were able to enroll into those studies directly from CardioCare. And as I mentioned earlier, if you set it up right, running clinical trials and if you enroll can be profitable. So net, this is a slide that our CFOs love to see.
And I think impressive if we look at 26, you all have one quarter behind you in the year, and the program is essentially already paid for itself. And this is likely conservative just given that the procedural billing is sometimes a little delayed.
Totally.
Okay. Lexi, anything to add there before I turn to FAQs because we've got a number of them coming in from the audience.
No, let's go to the questions.
Okay, sounds good. So a question to Lexi, both you and Rahul. What role do you see CardioCare playing in your clinical practice over the next 3 to 5 years?
Lexi, do you want to start?
Sure. I really think that CardioCare is gonna help us grow our clinic. I see CardioCare growing with real-time identification of patients and integration of any kind of inclusion or exclusion. I think that the world of AI is really growing. Our nurses are really excited about kind of hopefully pulling more EMR data into CardioCare. I think it's going to help us with faster enrollment timelines. I think we'll get broader patient capture. I think a nice thing about CardioCare too, and when we were pulling from our Echo database, there was little nuances, and I'm sure there's a lot of other large centers like us that have a lot of satellite campuses, and CardioCare really makes sure that we are capturing patients from all of our satellites, not just the main tertiary centers. So that's another plus too.
Yeah. Rahul, how about you?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. The only thing I would add is that, I see that the next 3 to 5 years will be going a lot more direct to patient. There's already pilot programs looking at this, because for a number of reasons, the waterfall effect of patients, being lost from the referring to getting to us is quite significant. So if we can try and bridge some of that by going direct to patients and, having them vote with their feet, I think we'll see a further increase in all of the volumes that Lexi was alluding to.
Okay. Another question from an attendee. How did you get stakeholder buy-in to get the software system?
Yeah, I think, along with the thought that referrings might not like this, I think one of the other myths is that it's impossible because of the IT lift. Granted, IT are typically a more difficult group to work with within the healthcare system. However, my experience, at least here, was once I got them in the room and explained what this was, why I wanted it, and most importantly, how it could impact clinical care in a positive way, their response was fantastic. And yes, these things can take time, but the key is having a clinical champion to drive it, because IT has 100 different projects, especially right now with AI, everything. There's a bunch of new projects on their desk, but demonstrating that this has real clinical yield, it gets you up the list, and then continuing to push on them and be engaged. So, typically at Stanford, IT takes anywhere, I don't know, from 12 to 24 months to get something in. I think we did this in 9 months, and this was 4 years ago when this was brand new, and there weren't a lot of other centers that we could lean on to come in and tell our IT team how great it was. So I think it's have that first conversation, bring in the right people, and then, depending on who you are, be that clinical champion to ensure it gets across the line.
Yeah, I think you're underselling the amount of advocating you did with the IT team. Uh, and I think Lexi, since then, because of I think a lot of the work you've done, you've been able to show these consistently positive ROIs to go back and show them what a great idea it was. Um, there's a follow-up question in here that's related, which is how is CardioCare incorporated within Stanford slash Epic since this involves PHI? I think this question might be getting at this is an overlay with Epic data feeding it, but Rahul maybe hit on how you got this incorporated, given that it's, a standalone cloud-based platform.
Yeah. So when we started, there was no EMR or Epic integration. It was just the Echo database. And then in later iterations, we sort of had that feature to turn it on. And of course, it has to go through all the regular compliance with IT and patient safety and all of that at the hospital. But there was no real issue there. It just had to go through the cadence to ensure that we weren't pulling any inappropriate data. For example, there's no pediatric data coming through. The the platform has all of the checks and balances required to maintain confidentiality and security of the data. So there was nothing really unique in that sense compared to any platform that's interacting with the data. And it's not like it's mirroring the data and storing it somewhere else. It's just sort of pulling from that EMR to the cloud and then sending that information to us.
Okay. Lexi, there's a follow-up question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the three features you use most in CardioCare?
Yeah, for me, just because my role is to try to find potential patients for Dr. Sharma, I am in the alert area like 90% of the time. Anyone who gets a new severe valvular disease, that is where I live. You can go into CardioCare and see my head right in there. I'm looking at all these patients. But I would say if you were a nurse coordinator in our clinic, you are probably more often in scheduling manager, you're in alerts, you're in the patient chart. I think if you are a research coordinator, you are either in the dedicated research list for your trial or you're in database trying to make a query. So I think it kind of depends on your role in the organization.
Okay, makes sense. Uh, Dr. Sharma, another question for you. You said eventually that you'll kind of run out of growing room with grassroots efforts. There's a question about can you expand on what you meant about the general limits of grassroots without an enabling tool?
Yeah, I mean, so time is probably the first one. If you're trying to see patients and put, devices and do procedures, you're going to have less time to go out there and do 10 lunches and dinners a week unless you hate your family. Um, and so that's just not sustainable from a time perspective. I touched on the return on investment in being out there. It gets very frustrating and you'll eventually give up because you're out there, meeting 20, 30 doctors or referring physicians a week. And you're sitting in clinic going, geez, I'm not seeing a lot of referrals from these doctors or they're not sending the right patients. I think your team also starts to burn out because, if you're filling the funnel with a lot of junk, they're still spending the same amount of time and effort to get those patients scheduled, to get their testing done. Lexi's hand's going to fall off because she's doing too many echoes on patients that don't have valvular heart disease. Your CT is getting clogged up with all these CT scans that yield nothing. And so you start to really lean on your resources, which everyone's struggling with limited resources, limited personnel, but it's not generating anything on the outset. I don't think anyone minds working hard and having long echo lists and CT lists and clinic lists if at the end of it all, you're doing more procedures. And then in terms of managing all of that, it's very hard to manage a large program, let alone a growing program, if the way you're looking at all those patients is an Excel spreadsheet, and then you've got post-it notes that are color coordinated to determine which patient goes where or who you need to, follow up on. The other problem is that, there's turnover. And so if you've got a hotshot valve clinic coordinator who, for example, wants to come to Stanford because we have an opening, then, the program kind of could die with that person
Yeah.
versus, and their system versus a universal platform where you can seamlessly bring in new people, people can transition out, and the program continues to move along.
Yeah. Uh, Another question on a related topic is as you think about all of these, I'll call them AI point solutions. So the ECG based AI that scans ECGs for disease, similar with the echo side. How do you think about that in cardio care? Are they complementary? Are they competitive? How would you frame the way you're thinking about just all the activity in this space right now?
So there's a lot of activity in this space, and I see a lot of it in the various roles I play. But I think, look, most of them are sort of point solutions, meaning that, like, let's take the ECG one, for example. They identify abnormal ECGs. From that, they delineate, based on their algorithms, which of those patients are more likely to have structural heart disease, and then that triggers the need for an echo. That's great because it's one of the ways you can fill the funnel. Signal to noise ratio is an issue. You don't want to fill the system with a lot of junk. You want to make sure that it's really a refined group. But more importantly, we've talked a lot about the benefits of this as a platform, as a workflow tool. So identification of the patient is just one piece of the puzzle.
Hmm.
If I came and gave everyone 100 new structural patients a week and gave them nothing else and no other tools, the program would collapse. You wouldn't be able to keep up. You wouldn't be able to track these patients. You wouldn't be able to identify where the bottlenecks are. You wouldn't be able to act on them. You certainly don't have the data to go to your C-suite to demand more resources because by just saying, "Oh, we just saw 100 more patients," they're like, "Okay, great, just
Yeah.
push them through." So I think that the benefit of this platform is that, yes, it identifies patients, but it's more than that. It's a platform from which we can and do actually work to optimize workflow.
Yeah. Lexi, anything to add on that from your end? I know there's there's people talking about various solutions all the time, and I think I've heard you both say we're glad we did CardioCare first so that we can think about some of these additional things.
I just think that integrating cardio care into your workflow in the clinic is just going to help with your overall patient throughput, patient centric, patient everything. It's a great tool. And I don't know any other area out there where you can just have kind of one uniform platform just with an entire patient picture, right? But we're just specifically looking at, for me, like the structural space, and just have it like easy and readily available and you can just pull up. It's good for, it's just great.
Okay, we've got one final question for each of you. So, for you, Rahul, if someone wants to adopt CardioCare this year and needs advice on how to advocate internally, what advice would you give them?
I would say identify the stakeholders that are going to be relevant to this. IT being one, your cardiovascular service line director being two. That's the first step. And going to them, and of course, Ignite's very good at helping with that, either by participating in those conversations or empowering you with the resources to do so. For example, just some slides. We share our experience if you need numbers to back it up to show the potential impact. That's where you start. And I think thereafter, once you get going, it's about bringing the other stakeholders, your valve clinic coordinators, your research coordinators, your nurses, your APPs, and then some of your main referring providers internally is also helpful to advocate for this. So that's how I would start in sort of a two-tiered, two-step approach.
Okay. And then, Lexi, the question for you. If you only had 2 hours a week to spend in cardio care, so we know that everybody's busy, there's limited resources. You both hit on this. If you had 2 hours a week, could you still make a dent in your patient population? And where would you spend those 2 hours?
I think absolutely. I would spend the 2 hours wherever Dr. Sharma tells me to spend the 2 hours, but I think you can definitely make a dent. Kind of everyone asks me all the time with cardio care, like how often, like how long does it take to review a patient? And sometimes when you're in there, like you get in the chart and you're like an immediate no, right? Like for whatever reason, maybe they are scheduled for procedure elsewhere. And it might take you, 5, 10 minutes of good chart diving to care everywhere to see if this patient's appropriate, but you can get through a decent amount of patients in 2 hours. Our research coordinators are a great example. I mean, if they can just give me 1 hour a week, like just that is immensely helpful. So that's where I would go, wherever Dr. Sharma says, and you can make a difference in 2 hours.
Okay. So whoever your Dr. Sharma is at your institution, take their direction and the 2 hours will be meaningful.
Correct.
Okay. Well, we are nearly right at time. I just wanted to thank you both again for joining us today. I'm sure this has been really helpful for those listening in terms of how to think about a program like this and its impact on trials and commercial therapies. So thank you. Shay, any last closing remarks before we let everybody go for the day?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us today and being active participants in the conversation. We want to invite you to continue learning about cardio care. You can visit our events page. I've already put it in the chat, or you can scan the barcode on this screen. You'll have access to this on demand. So if you want to go back or share it with people within your sphere of influence, please feel free to share it and to revisit any of our past webinars. You can also connect with us in your vows and see a live demo and connect with our team to ask any questions that you may have. In the interim, if you want to meet with anyone on our team, please send me an email and I will prioritize getting back to you to ensure that you're plugged in with a member of our team so we can discuss how CardioCare may meet your program needs. Thank you for joining the call today, and I want to thank Kayla, Dr. Sharma, and Lexi for sharing your experiences. Have a good day, everyone.